Good evening. Good evening to all of you. Thank you for being here tonight, and thank you for taking time to listen to me. And I very much look forward also to this being a conversation. Very much look forward to engaging with Ray, and also just to hearing all of your questions and doing my best to be able to engage and answer all of your queries. So, I want to start with a few sort of contextual remarks. And I'm a trained historian, so I think when we're asking the question of NATO's future, I think it's important to understand some elements of its past and some elements of its DNA, if I can use that expression. NATO will be celebrating in a matter of a few days, about 2 weeks from now, its 75th anniversary, which is quite an accomplishment in terms of alliances don't normally last that long. So it's certainly proven to be a very enduring alliance. And I want to really emphasize that from the very beginning, and I think this is an important element that sometimes gets forgotten in some of the conversations about NATO, is that NATO is fundamentally a political and a military alliance. I think we have focused, or we speak often about the latter, the fact that it's a military defensive alliance. But I would say NATO's durability is very much tied to the fact that from the very beginning, it was considered to be a political alliance. When it started, there were only 12 members, but nonetheless, I think that explains to a large degree why NATO was able to survive the end of the Cold War, when seemingly its raison d'etre, containing the Soviet Union, was no longer needed once the Soviet Union collapsed. So I think that's one key element, that it's the dual political and military role of NATO. I think it explains its durability. The second element, which I think is important when we're trying to look ahead here, obviously, for NATO's future, is I don't think it's fair to ever say that there was a golden age, to suggest that there was a time when all was fine with NATO and that we've entered a more difficult period, or that there is crises ahead or disputes that we have to sort of look into. From the very beginning, NATO has dealt with disagreements, disputes, conflicts. That's been part of its fabric. It's been part of its DNA, whether that was during the Cold War or since. So that's not unusual that there are questions about its continued cohesion or its continued durability is not particularly new. That's, again, part of NATO's existence. The third, I think, historical element here, which I think is important, should help to shape our considerations about NATO's future, is that NATO has often been a very versatile, a very flexible alliance. One of the key elements here that to emphasize is that NATO's founding treaty is a very short treaty. It's only about 14 articles. It doesn't say much about what NATO should or shouldn't do. It has some core principles. You've probably heard of Article 5, which is kind of the heart of the idea of collective security, that an attack on one is an attack on all. It has a couple of other articles, such as Article 10, that says that NATO is open to expansion. And as you know, it started with 12 members and now has 32. So enlargement has been a key part of its history. But the relevant element here is that this limited amount of what the treaty says has allowed NATO to take on new tasks, new responsibilities, new functions over time. And I think that's been very important for preventing it from becoming obsolete, from adapting to new circumstances, to adapting to new challenges. And it has, I think, fundamentally changed multiple times since its founding in 1949. That was true during the Cold War. It was true in the 1990s when the Soviet Union was no more, but you had wars in Europe's backyard, in the former Yugoslavia. You had then, in the age of the war on terror, conflict management operations out of area, like in Afghanistan. And of course, now with Russia's dangerous actions, a refocus on regional defense. So I think that's been important, I think, to understand the way that I think NATO has been able to thrive and survive, is because it is very easy for it to take on new tasks. And I would say that the final bit here about the history that I think that matters is there was a lot of constructive ambiguity in some sort of key elements of NATO. For instance, Article 5 was written in a way that doesn't force states to act in a certain way if one of their fellow members is attacked. It's really meant to create deterrence, to signal to adversaries that they run the risk of facing the whole alliance if they were to attack one. Now, and that again relies on the credibility of that promise. Okay, that's the core of the alliance. If Article 5 is viewed to be an empty promise, that could have significant negative consequences on the future of the alliance. If tomorrow Vladimir Putin was to attack Estonia or Lithuania without a major response, that would have a significant impact, I think, on the cohesion of the alliance. So I think those are elements here. I just wanted to sort of flag of the history of the alliance, which I think helped us to understand what it is today and maybe help us a little bit think about the future of the alliance. The second element here I think is important is to think about, although NATO was viewed primarily as a transatlantic and primarily focused on the European space, of course, in today's world, in today's globalized world, and with a rising China, it's harder for NATO to not pay attention to China. And we've seen in the last 5 years a far greater focus on the role of China and what it means for transatlantic security. Remarkably, NATO never formally acknowledged, mentioned, focused on China until 2019. So it's a very recent development, but we've seen dramatic changes insofar as the extent to which the alliance pays attention to China. I think there's a couple of factors that play a role. One, I would say, certainly under the Trump administration, the greater focus on competition with China definitely permeated into the alliance. So I think American priorities definitely had an impact on NATO. And of course, the Biden administration is also concerned with competition with China. I would say China's actions during the pandemic and its lack of transparency, its growing autocratic turn, if you think about the way China has acted towards Hong Kong or towards Xinjiang in its own country, has definitely made countries more concerned about Chinese motivations. And I would say, of course, finally, China's pro-Russian neutrality, if that's the most polite way we can describe its actions during the Ukraine war, I think have further cemented a perspective on both sides of the Atlantic that the room for cooperation with China is becoming smaller and smaller. But, and this is something I'm happy to talk about later on if there's an interest, what exactly it means for NATO to address the Chinese challenge is still subject, I think, to some important question marks. I think there are geographical questions. Are we talking about NATO being involved in the Indo-Pacific and the South China Sea? There are still differences of appreciation of the nature of the Chinese threat within the now 32 members of NATO. And there are always questions about priority. Is the priority defending against Russia, or is China the long-term threat that the alliance should pay great attention to? So I think NATO and China is a big question moving forward. Of course, the war in Ukraine, I think, has been a jolt of cohesion for the alliance. I think certainly has created a sense of renewed purpose amongst the alliance. I think there's been significant efforts to support Ukraine and the regime in Kyiv, whether through military terms, through financial support, through humanitarian support. There's been significant actions in the realm of sanctions and so forth. There's also been measures taken to bolster the presence of NATO troops on NATO states that are close to Ukraine and Russia. I think so that's good news here. But of course, with the war continuing, with a sense of relative quagmire and uncertainty about the fate of the war, I think this is going to raise some interesting questions. I think it's going to raise some difficult questions about what does a settlement look like if it comes to that point. I think it's bringing back to the fore the fact that you have historic differences when it comes to relations with Russia within NATO, which are unsurprisingly the product of geography and very different histories. Poland, for obvious reasons, is far more concerned about the Russian threat than, let's say, Spain again. I think that's just, again, the product of geography and history matter here. I would say the fourth point to think about when we're talking about NATO's future as well is the broader question of what I would refer to as the nature of the European security order or the European security architecture. If you think about the European security order as a mix between the key players that maintain security, the key institutions, and the norms and values that shape this sort of security order, those have definitely come under challenge in the last few years, even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but more dramatically so since. And so there's going to be, I think, some difficult questions about what does a European security order look like in the aftermath or when the war is over? What are the lessons that can be drawn about why this security order failed to a certain degree? Why was it unable to prevent Russia's aggression? I think these are important questions. I think there are different perspectives on what went wrong, but I think those are questions that NATO has to start thinking about proactively. And I think now is the earlier it can do so, the better. I always refer to the example to my students that FDR during World War II, his administration started thinking early, even as the conflict was going on, even as World War II was raging, the FDR administration was already thinking ahead about what would a post-war organization look like, what would be important pillars. I think it's vitally important for the United States and its European allies to do the same here. And I think the final question, I mean, again, it's no pun intended, the elephant in the room here. It's a year of very important votes. It's people have referred to this year as the year of elections because close to 50% of the world population is going to go to the ballots this year. There are a lot of crucial elections in different parts of the world. Some more competitive than others. I don't think it was a surprise that Mr. Putin won this weekend. I don't think that was necessarily hard to predict. But there are going to be important elections in Europe, important elections in India, obviously elections here in November, and those are going to be consequential. And I do think foreign policy, while not necessarily the most important consideration for voters, I think still features quite heavily this year. I think we do have elements of commonality between Joe Biden and Donald Trump when it comes to foreign policy, and distinct differences as well. So I think that element of choice is important here, and I think NATO is definitely one of those areas where, at least on paper, there's quite a difference in tune between the two. And I would just add as maybe a final point, because I do not want to be speaking for too long here, NATO is also going to be picking a new Secretary General. It has been led for 10 years by Jens Stoltenberg, who I think has been a former Norwegian prime minister who was quite an able leader for the alliance. But whoever the alliance picks, I think is going to tell us something about the priorities of the organization as well. So lots of uncertainty because of that. But anyway, I hope that these were sort of opening ideas to think about here in terms of understanding, thinking, and framing NATO's future.
All right, Garret, thank you very much for that introduction. I will kind of move forward here. I have some questions. I'd like to kind of frame our discussion a little bit. If folks from the audience have questions, as usual, if you would send them directly to me in the chat room. I think I'm listed as Indiana Council on World Affairs tonight, so you can just send it to that chat address. And I will ask you to ask your question kind of in order they're received. But with that, let's go back to Russia a little bit. Why does Russia regard NATO as such a threat? Has NATO ever actually threatened to invade into Russian territory?
Well, I would be tempted, it's a very academic answer. I'd be tempted to say yes and no. I mean, from one respect, NATO was a threat to Russia for many years during the Cold War. I mean, just because of the system of nuclear deterrence, you had a large number of nuclear weapons, whether stationed in the United States, some stationed in Europe, that were targeted toward the Soviet Union, and vice versa, of course. I mean, some of you may remember some of the trainings you may have received in case of, if God forbid, you had a nuclear attack. I mean, that was a concrete reality for people who came of age during the Cold War, and it's true on both sides. So I think that element here is important. I think you have a long period where NATO and the United States in particular were perceived as the other, they were perceived as the enemy. And I think that's hard to undo in terms of perceptions on ordinary Russians. And I would venture to say maybe the other way around as well. I think it's been, even in the 90s, even in that period of greater optimism that the West and Russia could turn the page off the Cold War, it was still difficult to overcome those decades of competition. Now, if we're talking post 1991, has there been ever a clear sense of the United States or NATO planning to send troops into Russia? Absolutely not. I mean, I think NATO has largely positioned itself as a defensive alliance. NATO also, keep in mind, made efforts in the 90s in particular to try and establish more normal relations with Russia. In the late 90s, they established a NATO-Russia Council, which was supposed to be a way to deconflict, was supposed to be a way to develop a dialogue, to develop better exchange of information between the alliance and Russia. Now, the debate, though, which and you've had people come out very differently on it, the question of, just because I say that my actions are defensive does not mean that necessarily the other side perceives them to be. Certainly, I think the way NATO has enlarged in the post-Cold War period has been a real bone of contention. It's true that if you look at the map, where NATO's line was in 1991 and where it is today has moved further east. It's moved, in the Baltic states. It has been moved on the doorstep of Russia. That is absolutely true. I think the difficulty here is that on the one hand, states are sovereign. I mean, the states like Poland, Lithuania, Estonia were keen to seek membership in NATO because they were worried about Russia rising up again. And I think also Russia's actions, to a degree, sometimes have precipitated the very scenario that they railed against. But it's true that enlargement has been a difficult subject. I don't think the West was able to completely thread the needle between respecting the sovereign wishes of countries that had been under sort of Russian control and Russian influence for years, and maintaining good relations with Russia. I think that did not work out as intended.
Oh, interesting. So, kind of a follow-up to that, to what extent would you think that the NATO fears are being fanned as a way to kind of keep Russians from thinking about internal problems within the country? Is the government using NATO as sort of to deflect that kind of internal resistance or discontent?
It surely plays a role. I mean, it's not the first time or the first occasion that you have a case of a country or regime, sometimes democracies as well, but probably more so even autocracies, that emphasizing, pointing out to an external threat as dangerous and therefore requiring loyalty to the regime in place, or by suggesting also that it requires certain forms of measures, or accusing this external foe of posing a threat to Russia. I think that's not uncommon. And again, I think it wasn't hard to sell to a Russian public and audience who, certainly for those of a certain age, had grown up with the perception of the West as an enemy. I think there's that element here that's certainly opportunistic. I think the second element, though, is also because I think it's fed into a real perception, a real narrative of resentment, of nostalgia. I think strategic empathy or empathy here means that we don't have to condone, but it's useful to understand the experience of adversaries. And I think if you try to put yourself back in the position of the Soviet Union / Russia, it suddenly went in 1991, it's collapsed to its smallest size in 350 years. I mean, it was a pretty dramatic sort of shrinking. I mean, the best analogy that I can use for my students at AU is to say, imagine if the United States suddenly shrunk back to its size before the Mexican-American War. I mean, that would be a pretty dramatic sort of bringing back to size. The 1990s were a particularly difficult decade for Russia, both in terms of the transition, in terms of the economic suffering, in terms of the economic hardship, and the sense also that they had become more irrelevant on the world stage, that that they didn't really matter anymore. And so, in a way, I think that's the second element here, that the more expansionist, the more aggressive foreign policy by Vladimir Putin, and we've seen that sort of become more and more prominent, especially in the last 10 years, I think has also been a way to try and act against this resentment, this loss of status, a belief, or try to force a will that Russia is still a great power, that it should be treated as such and respected as such. And I think that nostalgia has resonated with some ordinary Russians. And so I think that's been an important part also of why opposition to the West, opposition to NATO has been a very convenient tool, I think, for Vladimir Putin.
That makes a lot of sense. It was that movie that was out a couple of years ago, Wag the Dog, where they kind of use that internal problems as an excuse for war. Short of completely disbanding, what could NATO do today to kind of ease the tensions between Russia and the West?
That's a very difficult question. I think there's a couple of elements you can think about. I think one is understanding what Russia wants itself. Under Putin, I think in the last decade, so Putin nominally left the presidency in 2008, but he remained really behind the scenes and came back in 2012 with a vengeance. And in that period since, I think he's really pushed far more a line, and Putin is kind of the amateur historian, so he's also often used, albeit distorted history or questionable history to try and justify current actions. And I think he's really put forward the line that Russia is a special power and it's kind of its own civilization. Okay. So I think by doing so, he's essentially saying that Russia is not really a European power. Russia is a sort of Eurasian large landmass, that it can't really fit in any sort of Western system, and it doesn't want to be part of any Western system. So I think it's very difficult as long as, the obvious point is, as long as Putin is in power, it's very hard to imagine any potential for significant improvement, or anything short of a fundamental betrayal of NATO and Western values that would be necessary to placate Putin. Sometimes you do have clearly zero-sum oppositions, in my view, and this is one of them. NATO and the West, not that they would be perfect, but I still think there's a fundamental idea, a commitment to the idea of self-determination, that countries are sovereign and they should be able to make choices about who they want to be friends with, who they want to be aligned with, which alliances they want to be part of. It's an idea that has a long history for the United States. It goes back to the founding of the nation. Self-determination is a fundamental principle. And I think Vladimir Putin has much more of a 19th century colonial view. He doesn't really believe that Ukraine is a legitimate country. That's hard to reconcile here. These two viewpoints are so opposed to each other that it's hard to find a middle ground. I mean, it'd be hard to find a middle ground where we acknowledge that Ukraine is half a country or is half sovereign. I think that would be very difficult for the Ukrainians themselves, but also in terms of what the alliance purports to stand for. I mean, of course, at times you have to be hypocritical. At times it's hard to fully abide by your own values for an alliance like NATO. But that still, for me, is really a profound clash. The question, I mean, nothing is eternal. Mr. Putin one day will pass. One day he will no longer be president. The question is, will Putinism hold on? Like, how much impact is the current situation having not only on the elites around him, but also on Russian society? How much of what you could call the other Russia is still there, maybe quietly behind Biden bidding its time? And I'm thinking by then of the Russians who were very brave to come out for the funeral of Alexei Navalny. But how many are there? Is there enough of them to try and maybe put forward a different Russia, a Russia that might be, I don't think suddenly they're going to become sort of best friends with the West, but at least to sort of move away from the confrontational path that we've been on, in particular in the last decade.
Okay. It is a hard question. I didn't mean to put you on the spot there with that, but if you had the answer to that question, you'd be in Europe right now, right? Kind of look at more of the internal issues with respect to NATO. This 2% threshold for defense spending in each country has become kind of an issue with some legislators and other folks in the United States. How big an issue is it? How many of the countries are not even close to that, meeting that threshold? And is that really a problem?
Well, so I think the first question, because I want to make sure, Ray, that I think those hard, impossible questions are kind of why I like the job I'm in, because I think it gives us reason to talk and to think and to try and conceptualize. So I actually love those questions, and I think they're the most important and enriching ones to talk about in the classroom or elsewhere. On the question of the 2%, so there are debates, and I want to be very clear that I have quite a strong view that I think the 2% is a silly metric. So I want to be very clear that is a personal view. You have other people who debate otherwise. I'll tell you a little bit about why I have issues with it, and maybe you could take it with a grain of salt.
Maybe you could explain what that is. Maybe not everybody knows what that thing is.
Sure, of course. So essentially, the 2% metric was developed in the mid-2000s. It's in the context of, after the end of the Cold War, it was quite common for the member states of the alliance to significantly decrease their defense spending, what you could call the peace dividend. And it's true, it was true across the board. I mean, the United States still obviously spent more, but even the United States, if you look at its percentage of its GDP on defense, it went down from some of the heights of the Cold War. So that was not uncommon. However, in the mid-2000s, with the context of the war on terror, with the context of the war, with NATO's expanding role in Afghanistan, there was a sense that maybe the decline had taken too much, and there was a need to try and turn the tide. So they basically came up in a very arbitrary fashion. They looked at the average defense spending from the period between the early 90s to the mid-2000s. More or less, it evened out at 2%. So half of the countries were spending more, half less. So they decided, why not suggest that would be a good target for countries to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. That was not really respected. And the financial crisis a few years later, again, made it hard for countries to feel they had the public support and the bandwidth to do so. So defense spending continued to decline. And in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, there was once again a renewed focus that that the West, that NATO had really, that this had gone too far and that it needed to fundamentally arrest the trend. So the shift in terms of defense spending, you can really point to 2014 as a turning point. Okay, the trend has now been up ever since. There were only about 3 or 4 members of NATO that met the 2% pledge in 2014. We are now at about 18, and there are a couple more who should be hitting that either this year or next year. So definitely, that arrow has been shifted significantly upwards in terms of defense spending for understandable reasons. I mean, the security environment has become more dangerous. The public is more concerned, and therefore governments have been more willing to spend on defense. All of that is perfectly normal. I think the concern that I have with the 2% is that it really just only measures input. It tells you very little about output. It doesn't tell you about what you're spending your money on. It doesn't tell you whether you're spending your money judiciously. It doesn't even tell you if you're spending money for ways to bolster or strengthen the alliance. It's just a number. And I think that's where it's a very limited tool. It's also, I find, hard to compare because, for instance, when we're comparing the United States to its European partners, you're essentially comparing a global power with global military needs and global military ambitions to European partners who are much more regional in their outlook. So I'm not sure comparing the American defense spending to the European one is particularly helpful, because if the US spends close to 4% of its GDP on defense, it's not as if all of it is on Europe. I mean, a lot of it is to defend other critical areas. So even that is, so for me, there's limitations to the metric. Where it's valuable, if I can use that expression, is that it's a simple metric. It's easy to understand. It's easy for the political class to be able to point to, and it can be viewed as, or it can be interpreted as a sign of political will, that you are at least committing symbolically to spending more. But as a tool to really understand who's helping, who's contributing to the alliance and to collective security, it's not very helpful.
Okay, so maybe we could go back to something that was brought up in the article in our briefing book about NATO expanding its kind of geographic boundaries to start looking at threats that aren't immediate threats to Europe directly, or the United States or Canada for that matter. One of the things that was pointed out is that all decisions have to be made by consensus. I would think that as we expand these boundaries to start looking at other parts of the world, that it might be harder to get consensus. But this doesn't seem to stop new members from joining. So is this not really an issue, this whole notion of consensus? Is that relatively easy to get? Or is, in fact, the concerns about outside threats really kind of more universal in Europe now?
Well, I think there's, so if we're looking, I think particularly at the example of the main out-of-area operation that obviously NATO was deeply involved in Afghanistan, I think there's a couple of points here I think that are important to emphasize about why it happened and why. One is, I think, of course, and this is something not always well known, I mean, after the day after 9/11 was the only time NATO has invoked Article 5. So I think there was a symbolic element, but nonetheless, I think there was an important element here for, at the time, the 19 other members of the alliance to signal the solidarity with the United States. Okay, the trauma, the shock of the attacks of 9/11, I think led really all other member states to express fundamental solidarity with the United States. So I think that's important here. And I think that's an element that played a part here in maintaining a consensus and also leading NATO to eventually take a role in kind of crisis management in Afghanistan. So I think that's one element. I think the second is, when the alliance was established, there was very much an idea that the threat was Soviet tanks rolling through Western Europe and attacking member states. Okay? So the idea of limiting the geographical remit of activities really to that part of the world was particularly relevant because that was viewed as a primary threat. And interestingly, the United States, when NATO was founded, purposefully limited that geography because at the time, there were a number of European powers that had colonies, and the United States did not want to be dragged into conflicts between the European powers and their sort of colonial territories. But if you look at the context of the war on terror in the early 2000s, the fact that instability in Afghanistan, and the fact that the Taliban hosted Al-Qaeda played a key role, obviously, in the building planning of those attacks. So I think there was a sense in Europe and in the United States, of course, that pockets of instability in other parts of the world would not necessarily be limited to just those areas, that this could translate and travel and affect NATO member states. And of course, after 9/11, keep in mind, practically 20 years to the day was when, Madrid was hit by a major terrorist attack as well, with about 200 people killed in train stations. I was living in London the following year in 2005 when you had significant attacks as well. So there was very much, I think, a consensus here in the sense that these pockets of instability could be dangerous and could be a major threat and could affect the well-being of sort of, the territory of NATO member states. So I think that was important in maintaining a consensus, especially in the early years. I think as NATO's role became prolonged in Afghanistan, I think you started to have the harder questions about the balance of priorities. And especially as I think the Russian threat became more acute in the 2010s, there was a bit of a sense of should we be focusing more once again on regional defense, and are sort of NATO's global aspirations or NATO's willingness to take on these out-of-area operations sort of taking away from what was historically its core mission.
I actually have more questions, but I think we have a number of questions from folks in the audience, so maybe we can kind of shift over here. I have three. We'll start with Claire Collins, and then Denise Franklin and Ryan Wright. So Claire, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. I was just wondering, does Russia have nukes in the small part of Russia that's on the Baltic between Lithuania and Poland? And also, what's the border like there? Is it like a Berlin Wall? And I'm interested in the NATO as procurer of intelligence and sharing that.
So you're referring, I presume, to Kaliningrad, that sort of strange enclave. Yes. So I believe, and I'm sort of going to try to caveat, but I believe Russia does have some mid-range nuclear missiles in Kaliningrad, which actually played a role in the US and Russia used to be bound by what was called the INF Treaty, which was sort of signed during the Reagan years, which banned a certain amount of mid-range missiles, again, to try and sort of lower the arms race. And the fact that some of these new missiles in Russia seem to be developed and were contravening the terms of the INF Treaty played a big role as well in eventually the Trump administration withdrawing from it, which I think was, again, a further sign of deterioration of relations. As for the state of the border there, I'm not exactly sure, but I can say on the intelligence front, NATO doesn't really have intelligence gathering capabilities of its own. It's really much more reliant on the capacities here of individual member states. And there's, of course, significant differences. I mean, you have a small number of the member states that have significant intelligence gathering capabilities. Of course, the United States first, obviously, amongst those. But you have other mid-level countries, I would say the UK, who has close intelligence gathering relations with the United States, France, Germany, and a few others who also have their own capabilities. The challenge here is when you have, an alliance of 32 member states, is that your intelligence sharing is only as strong as your weakest link. And so I think there's been wariness historically within the alliance to share too much for fear that the weaker link could be penetrated by foreign powers that are a little too curious. I would say in particular, historically, there was concern about Bulgaria, for instance, because, of course, Bulgaria has sometimes been, let's say, the target of Russian eyes, if I can use that expression.
All right, thank you. Denise Franklin is up next, and then Ryan Wright will go after that. So Denise.
Hello. Thank you for speaking with us today. I have a couple, a question and then a separate little follow-up. How much of an actual issue versus red herring was the statement by Howard Baker that not another inch eastward? Is that really more of is it a legit issue, or is it more of a red herring? And then to follow up with that, you posed the question, how should NATO have maybe foresaw what was coming and been able to prevent? Is that even a realistic concept? Is it realistic to think that we can foresee everything, or even diplomatically diffuse everything?
Thank you, and Denise, thank you very much for your question. Yes, the February 9th Howard Baker Gorbachev document has taken a whole life of its own, and I think it's important to dispel myth around it. So I don't want to make presumptions, so I can at least say a few words about it. So it's February 1990. Howard Baker, who was Secretary of State at the time, meets Mikhail Gorbachev, and context matters here. They're meeting a few months after the Berlin Wall has been breached, and there is the question of German reunification. That question is suddenly back on the table, and it's a question that raises a lot of trepidation, of course, in the Soviet Union, but also within Western allies. I mean, there was a famous joke from the former French president, General de Gaulle, who said that he loved Germany so much that he liked that there were two of them. So there was still an element here for many that they were a bit concerned about what would a reunified Germany look like? Would it remain a member would it become a member of NATO? Would it become neutral? And this was not just an academic question, because at the time, you had a large number of Soviet Red Army troops that were still stationed in East Germany. Okay, so Baker is trying to make the case to Gorbachev that a reunified Germany, if it was to happen, it would be preferable if it remained within NATO, because it would be anchored, it would be surrounded, as opposed to kind of a free-flowing atom. But the question of not an inch east was also about the concern of what would happen if suddenly you had the German Bundeswehr troops moving east and being face-to-face with the Soviet Red troops that would still be there. And those Red troops, Red Army troops, would stay there until 1994, by the way. It would take 3 years for them to eventually fully leave. So it was a conversation that was in that specific context. Secondly, Baker has to kind of walk back some of the statements, because the language he uses is not very clear. It was not necessarily had been endorsed by President George H.W. Bush, so it was not necessarily presidential policy. And the third and the most important element that gets forgotten when talking about this meeting is, at the time, the Warsaw Pact, the military alliance in the East, still existed. So the Poland, Hungaries of this world were not asking to join NATO because they were still in another alliance. Gorbachev, in the meeting, the minutes of the meetings that we've seen after this meeting with, Baker, never talks about this being a formal promise, a formal treaty guaranteeing that there would never be any expansion forward. Now, is that talked about in the following year or two? Yes, there are conversations, but in diplomacy, I mean, it's conversations are conversations. I mean, it's not a formal pledge, it's not a formal treaty unless written so. And even then, the Russians promised in 1994 that they would respect Ukraine's borders. That didn't mean that they did so. So I think that's important, I think, to dispel that element here in terms of that conversation has been turned into something that it was not. I think that's important to sort of emphasize. As to your second point, yes, I think humility is really important. We can't foresee everything. There are unanticipated consequences. I do think at times maybe the US and the West were a little greedy in hoping that they could have their cake and eat it too in the 90s with Russia. I think they were maybe a little overly optimistic that they could have enlargement of Poland, Hungary, and other countries, keep Russia on the outside looking in, and that Russia would eventually reconcile to that. Maybe that was overly optimistic that it would all work out. But you're absolutely right that I think that humility, and I would say even that's where I try to tell my students that it's important to learn from history insofar as learning precisely that lesson about humility. That even when you have the best of intentions, that there are always surprises, that there are always misperceptions, and that we don't always understand our adversaries very well. And so I think that's important to integrate that when we make decisions.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for your question. Ryan Wright, you're up next, and then Pierre Atlas will be after that. So Ryan, go ahead.
Hi. So my question is about the U.S. presidency shifting. So if it does shift from Biden to Trump, how would that shift NATO's priorities, change the nuclear climate in Europe, and could the alliance theoretically implode if Trump kind of had like a loose trigger finger diplomatically?
You're trying to get me into trouble, Ryan, I think that was the question. No. It's a perfectly important question. I think there's a couple of points here. We do have, it's an unusual circumstance because we do have a case where we have a record of the two individuals as presidents. So we have something to look for. Now, granted, it wasn't exactly the same conditions in 2016 to 2022 and 2021 to the present, but that's an interesting juxtaposition that we don't normally have. I think it's fair to say that the relations between Donald Trump and NATO were not the easiest for 4 years. I think that's perfectly fair to say. Significant focus on the issue of burden sharing and defense. I mean, there was constant public berating. There was a lot of public disputes around the summits around that precise issue. There was tension. I think that's fair. Now, that's what we know. In terms of the speculation, I think we have to treat it with a grain of salt. But John Bolton, who was Trump's national security advisor in 2018 and 2019, did suggest in his memoirs that Trump was actively considering withdrawing from NATO in 2018. Now, was that bluff? Was that true? That's hard to say for sure. But even saying it, is concerning. The recent declaration that Trump made about countries not paying, that they wouldn't be subject to Article 5, is sort of an escalation. It's similar to what he said in 2015, 2016, but that's even kind of a higher degree here. So I think the relations would be quite different. I mean, I think they would be tenser under Trump for sure than they would be under Biden. I mean, it's not that they've been without disputes under Biden, but I think these have been less public. So I think that's one element here that as much as we can sort of feel pretty safe predicting. The question is, would Trump consider the sort of, the atomic bomb measure of actually withdrawing from the alliance? He can. I mean, the treaties does allow states to withdraw. They have to give a year's notice, but that is permissible. So that is certainly possible. But in a way, in my view, I don't think he might do that. But I think what he might do, which would still have a significant impact, is essentially ignore the alliance or basically stop committing resources to it, stop committing leadership to it. So I think there's a quite clear possibility that he would intentionally let the alliance wither and weaken. And I think that would be, that could have serious consequences for European stability. I think that's certainly a possibility here. I think also I mean, keep in mind that even if you have a Biden administration here, there are also obviously other domestic factors, whether the nature of who has control of Congress will matter, whether there will be continued support for Ukraine or not. I think it's going to be important because you could have a Biden administration, but if Ukraine collapses because it's no longer supported, and Russia starts to challenge NATO member states, I mean, we could have a major crisis on our hands, and this could be very divisive as well. So I hope I'm not coming across as too gloomy there, Ryan, but I do want to think that we're more likely to have tension under Trump, but I don't think we can exclude it under Biden either, if that makes sense.
All right. Well, thank you. That doesn't help us much. I mean, a little scary there. Pierre Atlas is next, and then Aaron Short will be after that. So Pierre.
Hello. Yes, terrific presentation. I'm really learning a lot from you. I'm really enjoying this. My question that I put in the chat was actually very similar to what Ryan just asked. So I'm going to modify it slightly. It's very plausible that Trump could get reelected with the Electoral College, even if he doesn't get the popular vote. I think that's a very plausible thing. And if that's the case, either he pulls out or the U.S. reduces its participation in NATO. To what extent do you think NATO would be sustainable without the United States playing a major role? And to sort of, since you already sort of talked about that a little bit, do you think that could lead to the development of a European common defense policy, or perhaps EU taking over a larger role in military defense if NATO sort of withers a little bit? So what do you see happening? Because I really do think it is quite possible that Trump could win. And as you say, he may not be able to pull out of NATO, but he could certainly diminish America's participation in NATO.
Right. At one point, I should have mentioned, and it's something I need to double check, but I believe that there is constitutional. There's a constitutional question. It's obvious the Constitution says about who signs a treaty and who ratifies. It's a bit less clear about withdrawing from the treaty.
Yeah, I was wondering. I think I'm a political scientist too, and I think that the Senate might have to actually approve withdrawing from NATO. I'm not sure about that either, but that could keep him from doing it. But then you could still have, as commander in chief, he could greatly diminish the role of NATO, even if we pull it out, even if we don't completely pull out of NATO. Yeah.
I believe that there was a possible case in the 70s under the Carter administration. The Supreme Court was reticent to weigh in on these sort of profound constitutional matters. Now, could it be different this time? So that's one also kind of added. The Supreme Court seems to be quite busy these days, so it might be added to its docket. So I think the question is here, without the United States here, I mean, this is significant loss in leadership. I think that would not be easy to sort of compensate. The concern, and that's interesting because that was sort of the American perception for many years. Like, George H.W. Bush didn't say that in so many words, but one of his arguments for why the U.S. should remain in NATO and why NATO should continue at the end of the Cold War was his belief. He's from that generation, the great generation that fought in World War II. His belief that Europe, led to its sort of normal state of affairs, would return to sort of quarreling and infighting. And I think it's a fair question whether, even that many years after the war, whether we might see sort of profound fractures that do exist. I mean, there are important sort of tensions, lines of divisions beneath the surface between, parts of Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Between Southern Europe and Northern Europe. There are differences of history, strategic culture, and threat perception. So the concern was, would you be able to find commonality, to find a mechanism to bring that? Because that hasn't really worked very well within the EU so far. Okay, maybe that's the electroshock that you need, but count me as a bit skeptical here. That's on the leadership front. On the actual capabilities front, it's really and that goes back to the point about the 2%, which is the EU combined spends a lot more on defense than Russia. What it's able to produce with it is doesn't get a lot of bang for its buck. it's a very fragmented procurement process. It's a huge amount of overlap, of duplication. Russia's on a war footing. They can produce 5 or 6 times more artillery munitions than the West. Would the Europeans be willing to do that? Would they be willing to put themselves on a war economy? That's not easy in any normal times, and we're talking about a European political landscape that is quite fragmented, it's quite polarized as well, and so finding the political will to do that, I think, is not a guarantee. I would say for the US though, and I think that's something important as well, you know, and this goes back to one of my earlier points, is NATO is a political alliance as well. One of the elements that would be lost, I would say, if the US withdraws from NATO is the sort of political support that you get from allies in other contexts. If you want, I mean, if Trump wants to basically withdraw from NATO and take a more aggressive attitudes towards China, it's going to be very hard to turn around and ask your European allies to follow in lockstep if you've just done that at the same time. So that there's an element here. In terms of, I think one of the important arguments for NATO as well is that it allows force posture of the United States. It has bases, it has ports, it allows to project your navy across the world. So there would be some losses and consequences here for the United States if it were to withdraw from NATO.
All right, thank you. Aaron Short is up next, and then Betty Townsend after that. So Aaron?
Yes, thanks for having us. I just wanted to ask, can you just share a little bit more about, honestly, what you were just saying in regards to opinion in Eastern Europe versus Western Europe, Northern Europe? I would love to just get your insights on the public opinion of what European citizens are thinking about Europe. I'd love to know their perspective on how they view some of these issues, as well as Russia. I'd love to know what Russians are thinking about the war in Ukraine from like an honest perspective. Obviously, Putin, it makes it seem as if 98% of Russians agree with this conflict, but would love to hear your perspectives on a more honest perspective there.
Sure, and thank you, Aaron. Great question, and I'll certainly declare my own humility and limitations where I'm going to be more speculative than anything else. So I think what I was trying to suggest about these lines of, I think that again they're profoundly historic lines of division. I mean, that's again what I think history really matters greatly. For 40 years, the Poland, Hungary's, the then Czechoslovakia and others were under Soviet either direct control, if you were one of the 15 republics of the Soviet Union, or under sort of Soviet influence under the Warsaw Pact. So they have, and for Poland, experience with Russia is much longer and much more traumatic for hundreds of years. So I think there's that element here of that bifurcation of history between East and Western Europe, which still leaves its traces. That's unavoidable. And so for many years, I think the Poland in particular, I would say at the forefront, but not only the Baltic states as well, felt that the Western countries like Italy, France, and Germany, didn't take the Russian threat seriously. So there was a little bit of "I told you so" here in terms of you ignored the Russian threat. You tried to work with Putin. You forgave Putin, or you tried to overcome even the annexation of Crimea. All of these other warning signs, or when the Russian government clearly authorized the use of Novichok to attack two of its former Russian citizens in Salisbury in England. So a series of those. I think that's an element here of a dividing line. I think there's still, the needle has moved a bit, but I think there's still some differences of appreciation between those who feel that you need to defeat Russia completely in order to have proper peace, those who feel that you need just Russia to be humiliated and chastened, and others who think that there might still be a glimmer of hope to come up with some kind of constructive relationship in the future. There are divisions over, for instance, energy ties between Russia and the West. Degrees of energy dependency are very varied. Germany for the longest time, Austria, Serbia, Hungary had a high degree of dependency on cheap gas from Russia. That's very different from other countries like France, who has its own nuclear power as one of its main sources. Spain, for instance, that uses a lot more of liquid natural gas, in particular from Qatar or from Algeria or from the United States. So these are also, I think, lines here of big differences. And then I'd say the third element here is within states as well. We have a plethora of populist movements that have a very varied nature across different European countries, but who approach relations with Russia very differently. I grew up in France. We interestingly have the far left and the far right who are somewhat complacent, I would say, towards Russia and Putin, who feel that, sanctions haven't worked, that really we need peace, that the fighting is just tragic, but without any sense of who's really responsible here. And so there are also these dividing lines, I think, within countries, within political parties, that are also important here. It's going to be hard to come up with a clear, it's not the same. I mean, some countries still have very high levels of support for Ukraine, but that's not uniformly the case across Europe. As for Russia, God, I mean, that's a difficult question. How much credibility should we give to the surveys and what we get in Russia? That's a very difficult question, because there was often a reference to inhabitants or people who were living under the Soviet era. They would be called Homo Sovieticus, and there was kind of the archetype of the Soviet citizen who was kind of would be careful about what they would say to the authorities. And so you have to wonder, to a certain degree, is there still a certain caution today amongst ordinary Russians to state what they really want to say? There's been an increase in number of denunciation. From your neighbors might hear you being a little less enthusiastic than you should be about the special operation, as they call it in Ukraine. That could lead you into trouble. There's monitoring and all of that. So, you've got to wonder how much is that skewing, or how much of that is fundamentally exaggerating the level of support that exists in Russia for Putin and the war.
Well, thank you, Aaron. That's a good question here. Betty, you're up next, and then Eric Johnson, and after that it'll be Lee.
Thank you.
Betty?
Good evening, Garret. How are you? I'm sorry I missed you at the very beginning. Yeah, I am so sorry I missed you. I want to say really quickly to Pierre, when you asked that question, now Pierre's usually the person that we go to with these questions. I thought, oh, great. And it's seriously, so he's on our board. Late last year, this was in 2024, Congress passed a new law on a bipartisan basis prohibiting presidents from unilaterally withdrawing from NATO without 2/3 of the Senate participating in that and agreeing to that vote. That's a really healthy 2/3 that would take, even with our own fractious politics in Congress at the time, getting 2/3 vote would really be a pretty aggressive reach. So we have, I guess, some protection there. I also want to thank my students for coming this evening. Several are here. What you have presented is tremendous fodder for what they have to write about next week. I may have to raise the word limit of what they have to write about. So I won't do that. But thank you for coming. Garret, my question is, you've covered so much this evening. Thank you very much. Currently, Moldova is not a member of NATO, and it is within their own constitution that they want to remain at least peaceful and neutral on this issue. They only have an army of 4,000. They're a small country in any event. But should they're without NATO's defense, should they be in Russia's crosshairs? This seems to be a country, there's been so much speculation of what if Ukraine falls, what's next? Putin won't stop. There was just in the news this morning that Poland has passing $30 million just for Warsaw alone to put in bomb shelters. They're used to this. They've suffered greatly during 2 world wars, but their crosshairs might be Moldova, which is basically defenseless. What is your speculation of what might happen? Do you see Putin even being foolish enough to even want to approach? Is he so crazy he would want to push a World War III? Or what country might be in Putin's crosshairs should he have his way with Ukraine? And can you even speculate? Dare you?
Well, it's getting late in the evening, so it feels like it's a good time to start speculating. And I have to also mention that one of the things I did love about Zoom, sorry, I'm going to call out Anne Kolb, because you're just on my screen and I saw the cat who looked delightful. So that's also one of the fun things about Zoom.
Yeah,
my cats have been forbidden because they would jump on my head. So the cat seems much better behaved. On the Congressional Act, yes, it's true that Congress, I think, and especially the Senate, has still been a bastion of supporting NATO. That was true, I think, during the Trump term. But I think I would still be a bit careful because, of course, senators come and go, and I think, especially on the Republican side, who we're seeing now more likely to be following the Trump line on NATO. So I think that could skew the balance over time. And again,
but 2/3 is a lot. Two-thirds is a lot.
It's true, but you could neglect it, or you could sort of sabotage it by not actively I mean, Trump could decide not to show up at the NATO summit. He could probably ask to basically shut down or close down the U.S. mission to NATO. I mean, there's a lot of other actions he could do to signal that he's not interested. But the 2/3, I mean, if that stands, is yes, getting any Congress to agree on anything with 2/3 is a tall order these days. What would Putin do next? I think the interesting element here is, I do think that even if he's able, and I think that's still the element that I don't quite understand even to this day, is even in the best case scenario 2 years ago, we were very worried, that a lot of commentators and experts, that he would be able to decapitate the regime in Kyiv very quickly. You're still talking about an enormous territory that would be very hard to run and maintain. So that was never quite clear to me, still today, like, what is the hope, or to what extent are you willing to go back to the days of the Soviet Union, when part of the Soviet collapse was the cost of empire? I mean, empire's expensive. Especially when you're trying to maintain people who are not happy to be under your leadership. So that's an element here which was not very clear to me. What Putin could do, and I think it's a concern, whether we're talking about Moldova, and true to a certain degree, I would say in Estonia in particular, is the way that you can weaponize Russian-speaking minorities. I mean, he did that already in Donbass in 2014. The fact that he could try to, short of war, he could still try to weaponize, create tension, create internal strife between Russian speakers and the rest of the country. Again, in line with trying to seek disunity, undermine cohesion, and try to create tension. I mean, that's something that he could do short of war that I think would be very detrimental. And I think if you're also talking about a concerning scenario where Ukraine has been mostly defeated, NATO is viewed as less than it was, the ability that, that would be prime territory, or I think a prime context where you could see sort of civilian populations being much more likely to being manipulated, to being instrumentalized. So I think that's the concern, is he doesn't necessarily need to go to war to create significant havoc. I mean, in Estonia, I think about 25% of the population is ethnic Russian. A number of them are still connected by language, by television programs and other, into kind of a Russian world, if I may. I'm not saying that they're all fifth columns, but that would be excessive. But it can certainly play a part in creating disunity within these border countries.
Okay. Thank you, Betty, for those questions.
Apologize for being the harbinger of, I feel like I'm being the harbinger of bad news today, but it's not normally my
Yeah.
personality. But
Well, I
hard
want to say
question.
really quickly, I think that Americans don't really understand that so much of the former Soviet Union or the old Soviet bloc really has people in it. We lived in Central Asia for a year, and the younger people do not. The younger people want to have relations with everyone, and particularly the West, that broader West. Older people, they be just as happy. They remember days of security and jobs, and they'd be very happy to go back. And they're still alive. They haven't gone anywhere. And it depends upon who has the greater propensity of voting: older people, younger people, and where the thing goes. So, and if younger people continue to leave and don't vote and don't show up and don't participate, well, yeah, so we'll see what happens.
All right, thank you. Eric Johnson, you're up next, and then Lee Andrews.
Hello, thank you so much for your comments tonight. I too learned a great deal. This may be a wild question, but Putin's recent comments about using the nuclear option, I just wondered, being a intelligence officer or whatever, your viewpoint of that.
Well, it's obviously always very concerning. You certainly don't want to take those claims lightly. It's also the stakes are so high that I think you don't want to be necessarily ignoring. I mean, and I'm going to give you an example here. I think it was unfathomable for many of us, to think that Putin was going to invade Ukraine in the first place. So I think it's very easy to become a subject to groupthink, subject to habits, subject to precedent, to assume that this cannot happen again. Putin has, I think, it's not the first time that he's used nuclear saber rattling. So there are certainly these cases where he's done that before. He has threatened Finland and Sweden in recent times. Because they were moving closer to NATO, that anything could be sort of on the table. So it's still, I don't know if I'm saying that because it's just horrifying to imagine the possibility, but triggering a nuclear attack would just be a completely suicidal. I think Putin is certainly prey to delusions, but I don't think I've yet seen sign that he's completely clinically mad. Subject to wishful thinking, absolutely. I think we've seen that, and that tends to be the case for ensconced dictators who start to become more and more isolated. But it's hard for me. It's such a shocking, idea to think of that he would be actively thinking about that. I hope I'm right, Eric, but it's shocking to think about the possibility.
All right, Eric, thank you for that question. Lee Andrews, you?
Yes.
Okay.
I've enjoyed this immensely. Thank you so much. I'm a graduate student at IU studying Russian and Eastern European studies, specifically hybrid threats in the Visegrad group, which kind of leads to my question. Do the democratic backsliding countries pose an issue for NATO when it comes to dealing with Russia with a united front? Is it kind of a chink in the armor, specifically, half of the Visegrad group and other ones specifically are well known for reaching out and being friends with everyone, even though maybe other organizations say don't be as friendly.
Yeah, I think democratic backsliding, I think, is a concern for, I think, multiple reasons. I mean, one is in terms of what NATO purports to be. Like, I think it wasn't necessarily historically, when it started in 1949. I mean, I had Portugal as a member, and Portugal it would be very difficult to qualify Portugal as a democracy in 1949. So that wasn't necessarily as vital then, but I think it's become more important in terms of how NATO wants to be and present itself. Okay, so I think that's one element. I think the other element of democratic backsliding is also because some of the some of the forces that have come to power sometimes, I would say in particular in Hungary, have been very, happy to try and bargain, get concessions out of basically playing the Russia with China card. So I think that element here, I think, has been troubling. But I would add, though, that in certain cases, I would say history and nationality can trump ideology. Even under Poland's previous government, the Law and Justice Party, that was viewed as concerning in terms of its relationship with the judiciary, this was still a case where you had a government that was strongly Atlanticist. I mean, that was a government, even, that had very good relations with the Trump administration and pretty good relations with the Biden administration. So there are cases where I would say, probably history and nationality matter more than just the backsliding per se. I think Serbia, for instance, not in NATO, but Serbia, I think, is playing footsie with Russia. But I think that's much more about, again, history and identity than it is about it being democratically backsliding per se, if that makes sense.
All right, Lee, thank you very much. The article mentioned the possibility of Japan joining NATO. If Japan were to become a member, what kind of impact might this have on sort of the Asia-Pacific power dynamics? China, for example, would they start feeling the same way Russia feels about them being constrained? And kind of a follow-up, what would happen to sort of the non-aligned countries? We had a talk by a lady from Indonesia the other day who were proud of their kind of non-alignment. Would this put pressure on those kind of countries to kind of take sides in this environment?
I mean, as of now, Article 10 of NATO would not allow for Japan to join. The article is quite clear that you have to be a European state, with the exception, obviously, of Canada and the United States, which was all grandparented in or grandfathered, whatever that may be. But the treaty can be modified, but as of now, that wouldn't permit it. I don't anticipate it happening yet or anytime soon, because in a way, there are other ways that you can sort of strengthen relations absent membership. Japan has developed very close ties with NATO in recent years, along with what has been referred to as the P4 countries. So that's South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. They have really actively sought to improve ties with NATO, in particular in the last 2 years. I think it's because of the war in Ukraine, but also because they have their own concerns about China, of course. So I think that's, NATO's role in the Indo-Pacific, I think is a really, really important question here, because when NATO started paying attention to China in 2019, NATO would argue that it's not planning to be in the South China Sea. They were just concerned about what they viewed as China's actions in Europe itself. That meant, for instance, the Belt and Road. That meant sort of the development of Huawei and sort of the growth of the Chinese telecommunication infrastructure in Europe. So there was concern about just that element in the transatlantic space. However, NATO is being a bit dragged by countries like Japan to pay great attention to the Indo-Pacific. I think it's creating some tension with China. It's also creating some elements of division internally, because you do have some countries who feel that the future is in the Indo-Pacific and that NATO has to be present. You have other countries, I would say maybe like Poland, for instance, who are concerned about China, but they worry again that a pivot to the Indo-Pacific would mean, again, taking your eye off the ball in Europe. So I think NATO is still very much in its infancy insofar as understanding or developing what a common strategy would be towards China. I would say, I wish I have some colleagues who are much greater experts on the Indo-Pacific, but I would say it's interesting to see the cases of countries like the Philippines, Vietnam in particular, who, are increasingly, because of China's actions in the South China Sea, are getting closer to the United States. I think that's particularly important. That's particularly striking. And particularly striking if you think about the history the United States has had with Vietnam, that Vietnam really is concerned about China, and that there's been some even strengthening of sort of military cooperation with Vietnam. That's pretty remarkable when you consider the history.
Oh, interesting. So Actually, I think we have one more time for one more question from the audience. Ryan Wright had another question. Ryan, you still there? Maybe Ryan moved on. All right. Well, I have two more questions here I could throw in. One is, how much longer can the war in Ukraine go on? I mean, what is sort of the end game here? Or is this an ad infinitum here? This is going to go on and drag on forever, or is there an end game in sight?
Well, that is, it's an incredibly difficult question because some of it has to do with the willingness of the Ukrainians themselves to incur, significant casualties and damage. I mean, they've fought incredibly bravely, very valiantly. How much more are they prepared to take? I think that's is a variable that's difficult. It's been very inspiring to see what they've done, but at one moment they have to think about that as well. I think the same for Russia as well. I do think Russia is putting a lot of resources in, but the more, and I'm sorry to be graphic, but also the more casualties they have, that will also start putting pressure on the government eventually. I mean, it took time. I mean, in the 1980s, when the Soviet Union was in Afghanistan, I mean, ordinary mothers of dead soldiers started to being a form of pressure as well on the authorities. So that can be a factor here. And the third, I think, is also it depends what we mean by the end game, because if we're talking about a Korea-like scenario where basically the lines of conflict start to solidify and the gains become minimal, and I think that's certainly a strong likelihood that this could be the case, because if we've seen anything about this conflict is that defensive positions have had a major advantage. We've seen that the use of drones has been very effective to provide key information and intelligence on the battlefield, and has really allowed defensive positions to thrive. So, the Ukrainians figured out last summer with the counteroffensive that making progress was very difficult. I suspect that Russia might also find the same if they try to launch their own counteroffensive. So if we have some kind of scenario, but it might be a piece like Korea, where technically we're still in a state of war today. I mean, I know there's not been peace in the Korean Peninsula. We have an armistice. We have a heavily militarized DMZ. I think a scenario of that kind is certainly not impossible, because I don't know what the agreement would be. I don't know what a large-scale peace agreement would be, because I don't see the Ukrainians recognizing the validity of any territory being taken over by the Russians. I don't see the Russians being willing to give that away in exchange for sort of other forms of mutual guarantee. Even if it's something like a promise not to join NATO, I don't think Putin would believe that that's really credible. So I'm concerned that we are likely to have a Korea-like outcome, which would still be a big factor of instability. And I think the point to keep in mind here is there are a number of those frozen conflicts across Europe that often get forgotten until they become hot again. That happened with Armenia and Azerbaijan, with Nagorno-Karabakh. You have Betty mentioned, if I may, Transnistria and Moldova. That's a risk. Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Georgia. There are a number of those spots that are very precarious. And so even if you have the end of fighting tomorrow, what is there to tell us, or what is there to protect us from 2 years from now, Russia trying again? So that's, I think, is a concern here. At best, we might get an armistice, but it's going to be a very precarious settlement.
All right. Well, I guess time will tell what happens here. So I want to thank you. We've had a terrific discussion this evening. I think the questions from the audience have been fabulous, and your responses have been insightful and very helpful. I think I'll turn it over to Betty, and since Betty is the vice president of our programs, and it's usually her job to kind of take us home. So Betty?
I know, well, open and close. So again, I'm sorry I missed you at the beginning. It's always great fun to say hello to everybody coming to the door. And I want to, and as I look at the numbers, congratulations, many, many people stayed, which is really wonderful. This is a topic that is of incredible concern to us. I'm having my own students. We're talking about, what, and many Americans around here are going to be looking at this. We don't border any of these countries. We're not a part of Europe. We have the oceans and so forth. And, the NATO's on the ballot, as are many other issues in November. And why should we care? Why does it matter? And we're going back to old history and have you. It's really difficult to understand. And Garret, I think you've done a wonderful job. Thank you very much for joining us and for talking about this. And the questions, I think, reflected tremendous interest on the part of our audience. So thank you. I wish we had a bit longer to talk about this because I think we could probably go over quite a bit. We should have made this into what we used to call one of our longer sessions. This could be where we sort of say, okay, if you'd like to go now, goodbye. If you'd like to stay on, go to your logger, get your favorite beverage, and let's get on with the informal discussion. I think you might have enjoyed that as well. But I do want to say good night. I want to remind everybody who attended this evening, we do have one more week to great decisions, and that's it. It seems like when we start at the beginning of the season, we have just so many. We have 8 programs, and we stop everything else. Last year, you might remember, we tried to interlap it with our other program series, and people were getting sort of program fatigued. But you have not shown any flagging at all. You have shown up every week. You come with us, and we appreciate that. But next week is the last week, and we are ending it with pandemic preparedness, and that will be Dr. Jerome Adams, who many of you might remember was the Surgeon General in the Trump administration. He is currently at Purdue University, and we look forward to having a really good discussion with him. And that will be our last program. And as always, it'll be the same time, Tuesday night at 7 o'clock. So that would be easy for all of you to remember. And then we go back to our regular program season. We will be into April, and next week we will talk about a really special program. For those of you who have missed being in person, we're going to give you that opportunity with our April program, and it's going to be on immigration and the migrant situation. We're going to be having a program, I believe, a workshop, and there may even be ready for it, some food involved. We'll be doing this with the International Center, the Global Communities in Indianapolis, and in the part of Indy that has the most fabulous restaurants of all, that has absolute eater's delight, and we look forward to that, so that'll be a lot of fun. And I know many of us have really missed the days where we could sort of be together, although we are very, very grateful for Zoom, because it's widened not only our audience, but also our speakers, such as Dr. Martin. It's been really fabulous for us to be able to sort of reach out and bring speakers, not just from Indiana, but from around the country, and even sometimes around the world. So that'll be great. But for those of you who would reunion for those days of actual personal mingling, we're going to be doing that in April with a great topic. And then we will have one more program in May, possibly 2. We're not quite sure. But stay with us. Again, I want to thank you all. I want to thank my students in particular. Thank you for coming. Thank you for hanging to the end. That is absolutely great. No, I'm not increasing the number of words you have to write for next week. Tempting, but I'm not going to do it. But it'll be a great discussion for us next week. So I look forward to, or maybe on Thursday, I've got the 2 classes, we'll see. But thank you again, and I say good night.